In the heart of Southeast Asia lies Vietnam, a nation whose modern history is marked by struggle and resilience. As we traverse the annals of time back to the mid-19th century, we find Vietnam under the yoke of French colonial rule. This period was characterized by cultural imposition, economic exploitation, and systemic abuses that fueled a potent rise in Vietnamese nationalism. The seeds of resistance, sown deep within the hearts of the Vietnamese people, germinated into a full-fledged struggle for independence, culminating in the First Indochina War. This conflict, waged against the backdrop of a rapidly changing world, resulted in the division of Vietnam into two distinct entities, North and South Vietnam. A line drawn across the 17th parallel not only divided a nation geographically, but also ideologically. This division, a product of Cold War geopolitics, set the stage for the conflict to come. The division of Vietnam was more than a mere geographical split. It was a manifestation of a deep-seated ideological divide that had been brewing for years. With North Vietnam championing communism under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, and South Vietnam, led by Ngo Dinh Diem, clinging to a Western-style democracy, the country found itself on the front line of the Cold War. This ideological chasm attracted the attention of major powers. The United States, wary of the spread of communism, threw its weight behind South Vietnam, while the Soviet Union and China, champions of the communist cause, lent their support to the North. However, it wasn't until the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964 that the United States significantly escalated its involvement. On August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox, a U.S. destroyer, reported being attacked by North Vietnamese naval vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin. 2 days later, another alleged attack was reported. Despite doubts about the veracity of these reports, they were enough to galvanize U.S. action. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, swiftly passed by Congress, virtually handed President Lyndon B. Johnson a blank check for military action in Vietnam. The United States began a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam, known as Operation Rolling Thunder. This marked a dramatic escalation in the conflict, as the United States shifted from a policy of aiding South Vietnam to direct military engagement. What had begun as an ideological struggle had now become a full-scale war with devastating consequences for the Vietnamese people and lasting impacts on the American society. It's crucial to remember that this escalation didn't occur in a vacuum. It was the product of deep-seated fears, geopolitical chess, and a series of events that seemed to confirm the worst apprehensions of those in power. This escalation signaled the beginning of a war that would last for more than a decade. The Vietnam War was a war like no other, characterized by guerrilla warfare and brutal combat. This was a war not just fought on open fields, but in dense jungles, murky rivers, and hidden tunnels. It was a war that blurred the lines between combatants and civilians, leaving scars on the psyche of nations and individuals alike. Among the numerous battles and operations, certain events stand out for their intensity and impact. The Tet Offensive, launched in early 1968, was one such event. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong launched a coordinated series of surprise attacks on more than 100 cities and outposts in South Vietnam. The scale and intensity of these attacks shocked the world and marked a turning point in the public perception of the war. But the war was not just defined by grand strategic offensives. It was also marked by smaller, yet no less significant incidents, such as the My Lai massacre. In March of 1968, American soldiers, driven to the brink by the relentless and shadowy nature of the conflict, killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians. The incident brought to light the dehumanizing effects of the war on those who fought it and those who were caught in its crosshairs. The human cost of the war was staggering. Millions of soldiers and civilians lost their lives, millions more were displaced, and the survivors were left to deal with the physical and psychological trauma. The war took a toll, not just on the Vietnamese, but also on the Americans. Young men were drafted into a war they barely understood, fought under grueling conditions, and returned home to a society that was often indifferent or hostile to their experiences. As the war dragged on, public opinion began to turn, sparking protests and calls for peace. The Vietnam War, with its brutal combat and steep human cost, was not just a military conflict, but a social and political one, forever altering the landscapes it touched. Amid growing public discontent and diplomatic pressure, peace finally seemed within reach. This glimmer of hope came in the form of the Paris Peace Accords, signed in January of 1973. These negotiations, while complex and fraught with tension, resulted in a ceasefire agreement and the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Vietnam. The terms of the agreement were multifold, but at their core, they aimed to restore peace and uphold the sovereignty of Vietnam. The accords also promised the return of American prisoners of war, a point of significant concern back home. However, the accords did not hold the promise of a lasting peace. Even as the last American troops left Vietnam, conflict continued to ravage the country. 2 years later, the fall of Saigon marked the end of the Vietnam War, with the North Vietnamese forces claiming victory. The Paris Peace Accords marked the end of American involvement, but the legacy of the Vietnam War was far from over. The Vietnam War left scars that run deep, both in the countries directly involved and around the world. Its legacy is complex, layered, and still palpably felt today. In Vietnam, the war's aftermath was devastating. The country was left in ruins, physically and economically. The landscape was scarred by napalm, Agent Orange, and unexploded ordnance. Millions of lives were lost, and many more were forever altered. The war also catalyzed a mass exodus, with hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese fleeing the country in the years that followed. On a socio-political level, Vietnam was unified under communist rule, but the path to recovery and development was long and arduous. The war also left a legacy of intense nationalism, born out of the struggle for independence and the fight against foreign intervention. In the United States, the Vietnam War sparked a cultural and political shift. It divided the nation, fueling protest movements, and fundamentally changing the way the public perceived the government and military. The war brought home the harsh realities of conflict, broadcasted into living rooms across the country, forever changing the American psyche. The war also had a profound impact on U.S. foreign policy. It led to the implementation of the War Powers Act, which sought to limit the president's ability to wage war without congressional approval. The Vietnam Syndrome also emerged, a national reluctance to engage in foreign military interventions, a lesson hard learned from the quagmire that was Vietnam. Globally, the Vietnam War set a precedent for guerrilla warfare and became a symbol of resistance against imperialism. It influenced conflicts and liberation movements around the world, from Latin America to Africa. In the end, the Vietnam War served as a stark reminder of the devastating human cost of conflict and the complexities of international relations. Its lessons still echo today, influencing how we approach war, diplomacy, and global politics. The Vietnam War, a conflict that defined a generation, continues to shape our world today. The Vietnam War, a complex and devastating conflict, forever changed the course of history. This was a war that stretched from the streets of Saigon to the corridors of power in Washington, a war that saw the rise of nationalism, the division of Vietnam, and the involvement of global superpowers. It escalated through pivotal moments like the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the Tet Offensive, and finally culminated in the Paris Peace Accords. This war left indelible marks on both Vietnamese and American societies, shaping politics, culture, and social norms. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a stark reminder of the cost of conflict, and an undeniable example of the importance of diplomacy. As we journey through the annals of history, let's reflect on the lessons that can be drawn from the Vietnam War. As we look back on the Vietnam War, we are reminded of the cost of conflict, the importance of diplomacy, and the resilience of the human spirit.